everybody. My name is Steve Grove, and I'm the director of the News Lab here at Google. It's a new team focused on working with journalists and entrepreneurs to build the future of media with Google. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this talk with Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn about their new book, A Path Appears. Before I have them come up, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Nick and Sheryl and the book, and then we'll start the conversation. Nick and Sheryl are a really dynamic couple. They jointly won a Pulitzer Prize together in 1990 for their coverage of the Tiananmen Square crisis in China. At the time, it was the first husband-wife team to ever win a Pulitzer Prize together, and Sheryl was actually the first Asian American to win a Pulitzer Prize as well. Sheryl covered energy and international markets for the New York Times, among many other topics. She's also the anchor of something that used to be called the New York Times Page One, which was a look ahead at the coming stories of the next day. She's also worked in the strategic planning side of the business and in the circulation department, where she ran an effort to build up the next generation of readers. So it's really a rare instance in which Sheryl worked both in the journalistic newsroom side of a newsroom, but also the business side of a newsroom as well, which gives her, I think, a really unique perspective on media and where we're headed. She's since grown an impressive career in banking and in financing, focused on technology firms, new media firms, and also double bottom line firms that look to do both profitable things, but also things that are good for the world. Nick is a columnist for the New York Times, as you probably know, where he focuses on human rights and giving a voice to the voiceless. He's really come to represent, I think, the conscience of the New York Times in a lot of ways. He started out on the reporting side of the business as a reporter in Los Angeles, in Hong Kong, in Beijing, and in Tokyo, obviously in China, as we said before. And he's the kind of journalist who will do just about anything to tell a story that he really feels needs to be told. During Nick's travels, he's caught malaria. He has confronted warlords. He's encountered an Indonesian mob carrying heads on pikes. He survived an African plane crash. Nick has been everywhere. He has done everything. And we're pleased to have him here at Google today. Hopefully it'll be a little safer time for you here in Mountain View than on the road. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize he won with Sheryl, he won another Pulitzer in the 90s for his coverage of the situation, in 2005 for his coverage of the situation in Darfur, and has also won the Fred Cuny Prize for the prevention of armed conflict. So this is truly a power couple we have here today. We're very excited to have them, and I think it's a testament to the fact that they're a power couple who uses their power to do good in the world. So please join me in welcoming Nick Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks. Well, welcome to Google. We're so happy to have you both here with us today.
Glad to be here.
And we want to dig into the book, but I thought before we got into some of the specific issues that you focused on, I'm curious what it's like to write a book with your spouse.
Well, first of all, I only had to write half a book. So
really okay. Nice. So you're half off.
Well, no, that's actually nice. That when you write a book with someone else, you only have to write half of it.
I mostly wrote subjects. Sheryl wrote predicates.
Oh, sentence by sentence.
That's right.
But this is your fourth book together. I assume you have a process
right.
that you...
Yeah. No, we actually take subjects. We carve out subjects, and then we write, and then we swap, edit, and rewrite. So.
But I think what Steve is actually trying to ask is, how do you write a book together and stay married, right? I think that's the subtext. And the truth is that we also have 3 kids together. And if you can raise kids together, it is infinitely easier to produce a book together. You can put a book to bed at night and it stays asleep. Manuscript doesn't play you off each other. If you screw up, the stakes are lower.
I've never heard a book writing process sound so easy, actually, comparatively speaking. Like you said, you've written a lot of books together. All 4 of your books have been bestsellers. A lot of your past works have been a little bit more journalistic in nature. This book seems to combine storytelling with a call to action. Tell us a little bit about the motivation for writing this book.
Well, I have to say that, first of all, because I'm not a journalist any longer, I sort of felt that I could leave aside this need to be balanced and factual and sort of not take sides. And our first 2 books really were like that. I mean, our first 2 books on China first and then on Asia, we really were still the journalist. And we were always accountable for whatever we said. And we were very careful, especially in writing about China, not to take sides. But it was clear just from the reporting, it just spoke for itself. And then in both Half the Sky and A Path Appears, we also did focus on the reporting. And I think that was part of the value in at least Half the Sky and now Path Appears, that we actually did a lot of reporting. So it wasn't as though we took a stand first and then everything was written from that one stand's point of view. I think the value is that we turned up things that were just so obviously horrific that the facts spoke for themselves. And so at the end, we sort of nudge. We don't want to really be overbearing because we want people to make their own decision. But there is a point of view, much more of a point of view in each of those last two books.
It sort of came about, and really because after Half the Sky, people kept asking us, so what can I do? And it does seem to us that an awful lot of people, kind of want to do the right thing, want to find a purpose or meaning in life, but worry about corruption, about inefficiency in aid groups, or just the problems seem too vast so that anything you do is just a kind of meaningless drop in the bucket. And it does seem to us that there are answers to those concerns. They're legitimate, that helping people is harder than it looks, but that we have much more evidence now than we had a decade or two ago about what works, where you get bang for the buck, and that there are things we can do where we can have a high degree of confidence that one can really have a transformational impact. We talk about clubfoot early on in the book. 1 kid in 1,000 is born with clubfoot. We never notice it in this country because if you're born with a clubfoot, then it gets treated right at birth, and everything is fine. Only when we were writing the book did we find out that my mom had been born with clubfoot, which I was completely oblivious to because she's very active and very athletic, and yet in some places in the developing world, that child will never be able to walk, will never be able to go to school, will become a beggar, and you can. With help, you can cure that child so that their life is completely transformed. And boy, that's when you see that operation happening. That is it's unbelievable what can be accomplished.
Sorry, go ahead, Cheryl.
Well, no, and I think that's really important because I think that a lot of people really do think, oh my gosh, these problems are so overwhelming. I mean, how can I even begin to make a difference? And what we think is so essential is for people to break down that problem into little bits and to realize that you can have extreme amount of control over a little bit. And I know how important bits are to you all here too. But I really do think that even transforming one life is pretty amazing. And if you can do that from scratch, help someone like Rashid, who is the woman in Niger, a girl in Niger who had clubfoot in both feet. And we actually found an American who was born and raised in California, who had donated $250 to help someone in the developing world get cured of clubfoot. And so we followed her check and found Rashid in Niger, and her money really helped Rashid get a better, get cured of clubfoot.
You talk about people feeling like they don't know exactly how they can access some of these problems or how they can help. Early on in the book, I actually wanted to read a brief excerpt that I think will resonate with our crowd here at Google. You write that so many social problems in the 21st century seem intractable and insoluble. We explore Mars, we embed telephones in our wristwatches, but we can't keep families safe in the inner cities. We can map subatomic particles such as gluons. We can design robots that drive cars and respond to speech and defeat grandmasters in chess. But we grudgingly accept failure in our struggles to keep kids in school off drugs and out of games. Why is that? Why does it seem easier for us as a society to tackle some of these, what we call on Google, moonshot problems than it is to do the really simple, important work of helping other people?
Humans are complex, and I think that we're beginning to understand increasingly that poverty is not just, the metrics about poverty aren't just amounts of money, of income that you earn, but there are pathologies that interact with poverty that are caused by it and then create self-replicating cycles and self-destructive behaviors. Poverty can rob you of cognitive capacity. There's some fascinating studies in India of IQ before and after the rice harvest. Before the rice harvest, when people are economically stressed, their IQ is 11 points lower than it is immediately after the rice harvest. When people are stressed in these ways, they sometimes engage in self-destructive behaviors, and these cycles can repeat. And these are hard problems. You look at child poverty in the U.S., and I think what Cheryl and I saw is that poverty in America, the basic kind of material situation, one is infinitely better off than if one is poor in Calcutta. But there is a sense of despair and hopelessness if you are a mom in West Virginia that is quite parallel to the despair of people in slums in Calcutta. And that commonality, I think, is kind of a reminder of our humanity and of the need to try to do what we can to chip away at it, but also the complexity of the challenges.
Yeah, I also think that there are more solutions that are coming to light. There's been a lot of data-driven, evidence-based research that shows this strategy is better than that strategy because they have done randomized controlled trials to show that a program that focuses on early childhood really can make a broader difference and change the trajectory of the life of a kid. And so while in the past we have done a lot of these interventions with kids in impoverished homes, often what's happened is that we've intervened too late. And now this research is showing that you've got to intervene a lot earlier. And of course, when you put theory into practice, and even if you take something out of the experimental stage from the randomized controlled trial, which is everything is very much controlled, into the real world, things do change. You may not get as good teachers, or the classroom isn't exactly the same as it was in the experiment, and maybe it's a poor construction, and so there's noise outside, so that it impairs the ability of the kids to learn. So there's a million different things that go on, but at least we have the beginnings of strategies that we know can work if we can actually get to that sort of perfect stage. Yeah. And that's really important because we didn't have all that in the past.
Yeah, I'm curious your assessment in all the conversations you had, how far along you think we are. I'm reminded there was an MIT economist you wrote about,
Esther Duflo.
Yes, who did a study determining that actually cook stoves aren't as effective as the State Department thought they were going to be, despite a lot of money and energy that went into them. And we're obviously a data-driven company here at Google. We measure just about everything that we do. Do you think that the nonprofit sector is changing because of people like Esther, or we have a ways to go?
Yeah, absolutely, it's definitely changing. But there are problems. I mean, even though we have these great evidence-based strategies, one problem is that they're expensive. Someone came up to me the other day and said that we have a nonprofit and we believe in this data-driven stuff, but the problem is it's so expensive. We're this tiny nonprofit, and so we want to experiment with these teaching strategies that we've developed, but I can't pay for doing a randomized controlled trial and have different sites. It's just too expensive, and so that you run into sort of the practicality of things.
Mm-hmm. But the change is just enormous. I mean, basically the nonprofit sector in general has hugely lagged the for-profit sector in productivity, in metrics. It's been much more about inputs, not enough about outputs. You haven't had the discipline of the market to create better productivity. But now, partly because of randomized controlled trials, we're just getting a much better sense of what works, at what cost, what our priorities should be. And for example, there was huge excitement a few years ago about micro-lending. And when it was carefully studied rigorously, it turned out, frankly, that micro-lending helped, but wasn't nearly as transformative as people had hoped. But when it was studied, it turned out that another element of microfinance really was transformative, and that was micro-savings. That most people around the world don't have a capacity to save money. They don't have bank accounts. They typically get money coming in once or twice a year at the end of a harvest. And then you can put money in a jar somewhere in your house, or you can buy extra chickens. In West Africa, you can deposit money with the Susu money traders, and you pay 40% annual interest on your savings. So if you give people a micro-savings capacity, that really has proved kind of transformative. And getting that kind of evidence about what works, where we should be investing, I think it's just far-reaching implications. And the real problem has been that we have the evidence now, but we don't translate it into policy.
And that's where the rub really comes, because you've got to shift then the cultural side of NGOs and different organizations so that they can actually move towards things that really do show that they are shown to work. And then also then with policy, certainly with early childhood education, we know that early childhood education is really important. So when President Obama says, I want universal pre-K, and John Boehner says, yes, I do too. I mean, he clapped actually, but then it gets stuck in the dysfunction of Washington, and things just don't move along, even though we all know that it is the best thing for our country's young.
Is part of that a problem of measurement? Because I know that, and you write about this in the book, that some of the benefits of early childhood education come 15, 16, 17 years later when prisons aren't as full, which is just a harder message maybe to convey, especially maybe to policymakers who are thinking maybe shorter term than we might like. Is there things that the nonprofit sector can do to communicate that message more effectively, or?
Well, those are the long-term some outcomes that are clear as well, but along the way there are lots of metrics as well. For instance, staying in school. I mean, that's one of the key metrics. So for younger kids, if they actually get not a head start, even if they are born at the starting line with everyone else, that's a real achievement, because so many kids, especially if, for instance, a lot of babies are born with fetal alcohol syndrome. And so you're way behind the starting line when you're born, because that does impair, it has huge amounts of implications for the brain development. And then smoking also has an impact. We hadn't really appreciated that years ago, but smoking also can actually lead to more violent children, partly because they believe that smoking creates a greater amount of testosterone. So there are implications there. And so you have, if the kid can start at least being born at the starting line, and then also is talked to, by the age of 4, we know that children of parents on welfare have heard 30 million fewer words than children of professional parents. So 30 million words by the age of 4. That difference, that gap, you can just imagine how far behind those kids are of parents on welfare. So, we have milestones along the way, too.
Yeah, I don't think that the problem is even length of time. I think part of the problem is that, if you're a member of Congress, then you are consistently getting bombarded with claims of evidence from partisans of every side, and you don't understand randomized control trials. And so you just kind of shrug it all and go with what your gut tells you. And one of the problems with some of the most efficient interventions is that you can't put a human face on them. So maybe the single program in America that has the greatest, most robust evidence of cost effectiveness is called the Nurse-Family Partnership. And it essentially involves home visitations beginning in pregnancy for very at-risk, low-income moms up to age 2. And it tries to reduce the number of moms who were smoking in pregnancy, drinking in pregnancy, doing drugs, exposing the kids to lead. Then it gets them to read to their child, talk to their child, hug their child, this kind of thing. And the impact is astonishing, and at age 15, those kids, 13 years after the program was ended, are only half as likely to have been arrested as kids randomly assigned not to be in the program. But you can't choose any one particular kid and say, look, this kid is shining because they were in Nurse-Family Partnership 13 years ago. And in general, I think why is nutrition? Why do we underinvest in early nutrition programs and micronutrients and salt iodization? Again, because it's very hard to put a human face on that. It's very hard for me as a columnist to write a triumphant column about salt iodization. I know because I've tried. And so I think that that is part of the problem, that some of the most effective things work on a statistical basis rather than through individual human triumphs.
In your columns and certainly in the book, you use so many stories of people that you've met to try to put a face on these problems. Do you feel like that works?
Well, there's been some really interesting research on what happens when you put a face in front of someone when it comes to donors. Paul Slovic, who's someone we also talk about in the book, really was helping. I think was CARE, and he was analyzing what happens when you see a donor, sees a potential donor, sees a photograph of one girl and who's starving, and how much do you give? And so you give an X, amount X, and then if they just add one other person into the photograph, let's say her brother, well, donations drop by half. Now, why is that? And that's it seems to be because you think that if there are two people there, you make less of a difference than if you see only one person there. So there is a lot going on there when it comes to just visual stimulation. And at the same time, though, researchers have found that donations really are kind of an emotional thing. You make a decision to donate based on an emotional connection, not so much a statistical connection. They've actually also found that if you give someone some statistics, like, if you can give $10, you'll save, 10 kids, or if it's $1,000, you'll save, 1,000 kids. Well, those numbers just don't do anything for people. It's that one kid that they care about.
In fact, if you ask people to do math problems first, to exercise the more rational parts of the brain, and then you ask them to donate, they donate less.
Yeah, I know. And so also, if your screensaver has like dollar signs on it, you're also less likely to donate than if it has fish on it.
Well, this gets into an interesting area that you cover in the book where you studied the neurology of giving. You both actually went to the University of Oregon. You got inside of a brain scanner. Tell our audience a little bit about that experience and what you learned, both the experience itself of getting inside that brain scanner and what you learned about the psychology of giving.
Well, that was actually fascinating. So now, because of neuroscience and the development of the fMRI, they actually can see what happens in the brain when you give and when you get. And so there are a number of researchers that have put hundreds of people through these brain scans to come up with a composite and see what happens at on the average. And it turns out that when you give, you actually stimulate the pleasure center of your brain, which is the same pleasure center that is stimulated when you eat chocolate or ice cream, or when you flirt, when you fall in love. Also, when you get addicted to drugs, it is that addiction center too, which I guess means that you might be able to be addicted to giving. But they also have found that in half or even sometimes more subjects, those people feel more pleasure when they actually give than when they get, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So you were wheeled into this scanner and you were shown images of the organizations you wanted to give to, and they just checked your brain for how you were responding to those opportunities.
That's right. We had a screen in front of us and a clicker, and so we were told, okay, you haven't given X amount of money, and then they're monitoring the nucleus accumbens in these pleasure centers, and they see how much they light up, and then you're asked, okay, do you want to give $20 to Helen Keller International, for example, and you can say yes or no, and they see when you say yes what that does again to the nucleus accumbens, and again how much it lights up, and this really confirms this, this broader lesson, which, goes back to ancient scripture that is more blessed to give than to receive, and it really does seem to be modern neuroscience behind it, and also population studies. One of my favorite studies looked at a population of seniors and found that those who joined a religious organization, went regularly to religious services, their mortality risk for that year dropped 29%. Those who exercised regularly dropped 30%. Those who volunteered for multiple organizations, their mortality risk that year dropped 44%. And presumably, if you just managed to volunteer for a religious running organization, you're immortal,
The jackpot, yeah, the perfect storm. You're talking a lot about sort of the personal connection to the person that you're giving to, and you write in the book about sort of having proximity to someone else's pain and how seeing. You talk about walking through, for example, camps in Darfur where families are giving almost their whole life to help their neighbor out when someone far away might not do that. It doesn't make them worse of a person. They can't feel the power of that story. Society has also become more equal and more unequal, and so people don't have access to some of those stories. I wonder if you think about the internet and the power of sort of social media and the internet to give people access to stories of people who need help. Is that increasing, do you think, people's ability to sympathize, or is it desensitizing us? What do you make of the internet's influence on people's desire and propensity to give?
I think that it helps, certainly, but I think that also in real life, I mean, you want to have a personal sort of visualization or, meet someone in person. I think that really makes a big difference, because right now I think the logic for researchers who have examined this phenomenon, they're saying, well, why is it that people who are wealthy tend to be less, it turns out that people that 20% lower income, 20% of the people with the lowest income, they basically give a larger percentage of their income to charity than people at the top 20%. And so it's not as though the people at the top 20% are less compassionate. It's just that one explanation is that they just are not surrounded by need. And when we do better, we become more wealthy, we move into houses, we get bigger houses, we get bigger plots of land, maybe a fence around it. So we're kind of fenced out of the need around us, or we live in nice neighborhoods, so we also almost never interact with people in need. And so when you're actually in a poorer neighborhood, you're on the lower income spectrum, you see need all the time, and so you feel obligated to give, you feel compassionate, it moves you to give. Susan Fiske, who is a researcher at Princeton University, she's looked at successful people, and she looked at their brain scans of what happens when they are shown pictures of people who are homeless, and they see those people as objects, not even as human beings. So in other words, she calls it the otherization of these people. The wealthy people and the successful people are otherizing, turning into objects people who are really human beings. So that's a phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I'm skeptical, frankly, that the internet changes that. I mean, I think partly through self-selection. I think maybe empathetic, compassionate people will seek out, depictions of people in need, and their empathy will be reinforced. I think less empathetic people will manage to avoid those depictions. We in the news media could be quite useful, especially television, could be quite powerful if we projected into living rooms or onto your screen the stories of disadvantaged people. But I think that we historically have not done a good job with that, and I think that now, as the business model of television collapses and everybody is desperate for ratings, I think that's going to be substantially less likely in the next 15 years. One of the things that I found really dispiriting as a journalist was that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had essentially bribed ABC News to cover global nutrition, global health. It wasn't called a bribe, it was called a grant. But, and it was controversial within the development community, because why should Bill and Melinda Gates be giving money not to vaccine children or to vaccinate children or to provide bed nets or to save lives in some other way, but rather to pay overpaid television executives to do what they should be doing anyway. But in fact, after a year, it was regarded as quite successful. ABC News did some really good coverage of nutrition, of maternal health, and it projected those issues on the agenda in ways that would get more resources to them. So after a year, Gates Foundation was ready to renew the bribe, and ABC News said, no, we don't want to take your money, because we see that when we air these pieces, then that's when viewers switch the channel. I find that just really discouraging, and I think that television and other news organizations are going to take the hint that that is not what viewers want, and that you can make more money and get higher ratings if you put a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and have them yell at each other. And if that's the case, then these issues just aren't going to get on the agenda. And then if that's the case, they're not going to get addressed.
What have you seen that has been effective to get these issues on the agenda and cut through the clutter of the chaos online or on television?
Well, advocacy is one really important tool, and I think that particularly companies, they have a huge influence when they actually do advocate for issues. And so if companies are willing to take on some of these issues, that actually just improves society around them too. I mean, it doesn't have to be at the really, really local level, it could be at the more national level, but ultimately it also helps enhance the brand of a company if they take on some of these issues that most people don't disagree with. It's just that it needs help to be pushed through sort of the Washington mechanism. And so I do think that advocacy is one area, and individuals can also play a role in advocacy. We often think, oh, how can one person make such a difference? Well, in the same way that you go out and vote, and your vote amassed with all the others, it does ultimately make a difference. Same thing with advocacy. I mean, if you write, this sounds very old-fashioned, but if you write to your congressperson, man or woman, that they want to hear. I mean, they, obviously, they want to hear lots of voices, and now there are petition, mechanisms through change.org or moveon.org. A lot of ways that you can actually get lots of signatures to send something to your congressperson to get a message across. They need to hear this, because if they don't hear from their constituents, then of course they're not going to think that it's an important issue, and they won't put themselves on the line.
I've also become a believer in selectivism, somewhat against my better judgment. That I found the Joseph Kony campaign kind of fascinating, and it was much criticized for lots of reasons. But I found it just astonishing that here's a story: the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, Central African Republic, Congo, that basically we in the news media didn't cover. And all of a sudden, every school kid in America was passionate about the issue. And the upshot was more resources going to the anti-LRA campaign. The number 2 under Kony has just surrendered. Attacks by the LRA have dropped more than 90%. And I think that there are some kinds of storytelling that just work from the grounds up, and that as we in the news media drop the ball on some of these stories, sometimes people are able to pick them up and spread the word, and people want to participate. The Bring Back Our Girls campaign was another example. Now, it obviously did not bring back those 200 plus Nigerian girls. I think that it did get the Nigerian government and some other governments more focused on the idea of educating girls, incredibly disenfranchised part of those populations. So here and there may be ways for effective storytelling, effective grassroots campaigns by people to kind of keep issues alive in ways that raise issues on a global agenda, get resources, and bring some results, if imperfect results.
Yeah, I guess your point is that there's not really any downside to selectivism. Selectivism is, doing something you think is going to help, and it's very sort of empty, but it might create some momentum around an action.
Well, certainly awareness. I mean, that's really hard to break through all of the stuff that comes out, on the web. I think it really is important that if you can actually break through that and raise awareness about girls' education in Nigeria, after all, I mean that's a real accomplishment.
We want to turn to our audience for questions in a moment. I'm wondering what you think tech companies like Google could be doing more effectively to help people access opportunities to make a difference.
Well, I think that we actually have a lot of ideas in A Path Appears, and I think that, first of all, at an individual level, I think it's important for people to say, hey, if they like what they learn about or read or whatever, then to say, hey, this is something that I do care about, I want to play a little bit of a role. It just can start out very, very small. And I think that's what's so important about what we're trying to convey, is that this is not something you have to drop everything and then go off to India or whatever. This is something you can do in bite-sized pieces, because I think that as long as everyone or many people together, devote a little bit of their time, an hour a month, start out with an hour a month. It could be really, really manageable. Over time, I think you'll find that you'll get a lot more out of it. Some people there has been also research that shows that when you give back, maybe on a typical Saturday, once a week, you really can take on more sort of work pressure, because that gives you a way to accommodate all the pressure you feel in the rest of your world, so that it really does alleviate some of the burden. And that's partly because of the neuroscience that we talked about, that when you give, you're actually doing something in your brain that actually gives you pleasure. And so it's kind of a relief from your workaday world. So it's not only good for society, but it's also good for you. And I think that our approach is really to start small and do it with friends. And then maybe if you can engage the company to do something all together, that's even more powerful.
I would just add that I think corporate America generally, and the tech sector in particular, has done a pretty lousy job with corporate social responsibility, CSR programs. That these tend to be window dressing, these tend to be off foisted on the side. The people in them very often are people who haven't made it in the mainstream of the organization. They're not going to then go on and ever run the company. And not only do they not do much in terms of really making a difference in society, they don't do much for recruitment, for retention, for morale of the company. And I think especially if we're a company that cares about its brand, that cares about millennials, I think millennials, much more than my generation, when they're looking for a place to work, they want a company that has some values. I think increasingly the consumers themselves will be making decisions about what is, about charity, if you will, not just writing charitable donation checks at the end of the year, but in terms of their consumer choices, maybe in terms of their investment choices. And I don't think this is sunk into CEOs around the country generally, that CSR could be a very powerful way if they actually do something and to really improve, to really try to change the dynamic within the company, as well at the same time to really make a difference beyond.
Of course, present company excluded. There have been some really interesting examples. For instance, a major accounting firm was noticing that the turnover rate among their millennials was much higher than among everyone else in the corporation. And they just were wondering what's going on. And so they started doing interviews and investigating, and they discovered that a lot of the younger recruits were saying, well, if I'm going to be spending 16 hours of my day at a company, I want to know what kind of value is it contributing to society. And an accounting firm, what can I say? What kind of value? And so they had to work at that. They actually had to really create programs that allowed a lot of the young, or anybody in the company, to try and give back or to help out, do some accounting for a nonprofit. They had to devise ways to actually show that there really was a place in society where these organizations were playing a really fundamental, important role. And I thought that was very interesting, and I think this just happened to be a case study for this accounting firm, but I think this is probably happening across the corporate spectrum.
Great. Well, why don't we turn to our audience for questions from those who are here? I think we have a few roving mics. Just throw your hand up in the air, and we'll pass the mic over.
Easy questions to me, hard questions to Sheryl.
Hi, my name is Danielle Bowers, and I found your comment about Bill Gates and ABC extremely interesting. So I'm curious, with all the studies that you guys have done, what would you recommend ABC, how would you recommend they tell that story that might not sadden viewers and might actually inspire them to act?
I think there are two lessons from the data about what works. One is that you have to open up the pathway with an individual story and make an emotional connection before you make a rational one. So you find one particular very, very compelling anecdote, and then you can broaden it out from there. And the second one is that it has to ultimately be uplifting to show that change is possible. And so there can be a desperate part of it, but the end should be this arc that shows that there can be an impact if people do something. So the dog can be desperately unhappy for a moment, but then has to emerge as this super dog because somebody cared about that dog. And then you have to show, after people are feeling, compassionate for that dog, then you have to say, okay, there are X zillion dogs out there in the same situation. And once people have had that connection, then it's okay to throw in some data.
And sometimes that's really tricky, because when you get to the news and the newsrooms, they're like, we just want to report the facts, and we can't manipulate. But there is some degree of so to speak, manipulation, just by virtue of the facts that you select to put in there. Yeah. But it is true that there's been a hesitancy among reporters to say, well, I'm not going to do this ARC thing because it's kind of it isn't really what's there, and we have to report what's there. So there's a little bit of a tension.
Other questions?
So as you know, Google is constantly trying to optimize user experience based on what we know about users. And there's always a certain amount of background noise out in the world about Google being manipulative as opposed to doing this as a service to the users. There's always this sort of tension about how this is perceived. It might seem like a no-brainer that trying to get to know the users in order to sell them toothpaste is perhaps not as noble as trying to get to know the users so that you can get them to contribute to worthy causes. But is there still an issue there about how far an organization like Google should go before it becomes manipulative and we're basically convincing people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do?
That's a really interesting question. I would say, other people say, well, then, everyone has different definitions of good. And so it'll be, well, my definition of good, is very fair and balanced, and your definition of good is not, so therefore you shouldn't be manipulating all the way to the end. But I think that, I would set that bar pretty high, that you really can do a lot more before you get to the point where you're really hurting. I mean, obviously, if at some point you're going to be doing harm. So whether it's invading privacy, or whether it's whether it's excluding other voices from getting in. I mean, there are a number of things you'd have to also analyze as to what the downside is from this extra, so to speak, manipulation. But I think that I would set that bar pretty high.
Yeah, in general, I'm wary of manipulation. Maybe one rare case where I think I'd be sympathetic would be in like dramas and television dramas. I think there's pretty good evidence. I mean, 16 and Pregnant, for example, the MTV show seems to have dramatically reduced teen pregnancy in America by kind of reminding teenagers just how much of a hassle it is to be a mom at 16. And there is likewise evidence from India that television arriving in a village, bringing in kind of middle-class values to a village, is equivalent to 6 years education in terms of improving women's rights in that village. I must say, as a scribbler who tends to have a great deal of disdain for television, this was really hard for me to accept. But I think you can make a case in those cases, maybe. But in general, I think that one should be wary of being didactic, of manipulating results for kind of social good. I think it does breed backlash.
I think it depends on what you mean by manipulation. If it's just, we really would have to sort of set certain parameters, and it's not as though you're deceiving people or you're crowding out other voices, other counter voices that would say, well, this isn't really the good that you're doing. I mean, I think it really just depends. Yeah. And maybe manipulation is too strong a word. I don't know.
Line between storytelling and manipulation, basically. Yeah.
Or advocacy.
Yeah, right. Other questions? Yeah. Actually, where is are we just sort of passing it around? There we go.
And I'll pass it to these people right next.
Okay.
So first of all, I wanted to just say thank you so much for doing the work you're doing. Just speaking personally, I did not used to give, and because of an article you wrote, I began to give. So not that I have that much money, but I think you've really impacted people in your books that you've written together. And I've been wondering this question a lot and asking some friends, and I'd love to ask you, could you name like 5 or 10 charities that you think make the most impact? Because some of the charities, the one you wrote about in an article, Fistula Foundation, was a great example. Could you name 5 or 10 of them?
In the back of the book, we have a list. We have a whole list
of
them. Absolutely. But reach out and read is a great organization that helps kids read. It basically prescribes books, just like it does medicines for parents to give their children. And so it says, okay, you've got to prescribe reading, 30 minutes a day to even your 6-month-old. So that's a typical organization. But there are a whole bunch based on what your interests are. And what we really there are a couple things I would say about this. One is that it's really important to focus on outcomes. A lot of organizations do, like they'll say that they send 100 million books out, whatever. But, did children really receive them? Did they read the books? I mean, I think the focus on outcomes is really important. The second thing is that it really depends on what you're interested in. I think that, some people, healthcare, maybe they're not as interested in healthcare as they are in education. And so for us to say, well, you should give to this healthcare organization, well, may not do much to you, do much for you. And so I think it's really important for you to figure out what areas you care about and then bring some friends along, because when you do it together, you can discuss some of these issues. You can discuss which organizations you want to give to. You can maybe have rotating organizations.
Yeah, you recommend in the book having like a giving club with your friends and meeting
Exactly.
once a month, so.
Exactly. Start off with a book club and then turn it into a giving club.
Other questions? Here we go.
Thank you so much. Nick, I heard you speak at an event very eloquently about the unfair bifurcation between the noble nonprofit and the greedy for-profit. And in my experience, especially recently, a lot of people with financial resources are more likely to invest in social entrepreneurs who may have for-profit companies, but they're working on amazing contributions from eradicating disease to transforming education. That wouldn't move the needle on that top 20% that you mentioned, necessarily making nonprofit donations, but given that it's still contributing, hopefully, to an efficient, more productive world, what are your thoughts on that?
This is really Sheryl's world more than mine. Because Sheryl is precisely kind of raising capital often for companies for-profit companies that do good.
In general, right now, in the past, we always thought of the nonprofits as the engines of good, but right now, it's a free-for-all. There are a lot of corporations that are doing great good, and there are actually some nonprofits who aren't doing good, maybe even doing harm. And so it's really important that we also borrow from the for-profit world. So for instance, marketing. In the nonprofit world, marketing is considered an evil activity. Well, if you don't market, what better cause to market than a really good social cause, right? And so I think that there's really this melding and there's just a mixing up of all these different things. As long as there's a social mission to a for-profit enterprise, they really can accomplish a great deal. And if it's incorporated into the DNA of the company, then each widget that they sell then accomplishes something. So, for instance, healthcare is really much easier to do that because supposedly if you've developed this new medicine that is helping people with asthma or a device that helps them with asthma, each device that you sell will help people. But, at some point when these corporations get very large, then there's a lot of tension because, maybe you want to oversell or maybe we're getting into the manipulation here. Maybe you're trying to manipulate things in order to get more product out the door because you have these profit goals to make. So it does get tricky, but in general, we think that it's a good thing that for-profit companies are actually beginning to think about incorporating a social mission into their companies. It's harder because you've got a social bottom line and you've got a financial bottom line, and some in the environmental space have an environmental bottom line, so it's getting a lot harder. But we think that, we all have to make this place, we have to work to make this world a better place because we have to live in it. But, we think it's really just a good trend.
One thing I'd add is that, philanthropy, whether it's to nonprofits or to for-profits with a social mission, is great and very important and can make a huge difference for individuals. And there are some areas, though, where you really need government action. You would never think about building an interstate highway system financed through bake sales and volunteers going out with a shovel to dig one more foot of highway. And in the same way, we desperately need early childhood interventions in this country. And it is kind of crazy to do the equivalent of trying to finance it through bake sales. I think one of the big problems in this country is we perceive poverty through this prism of personal responsibility. And there is something to it. There are occasions when poverty is associated with irresponsible behavior. You have a huge problem with teenage pregnancy. 30% of American girls get pregnant by age 19, and that involves plenty of irresponsibility on the part of both the guys and the girls not using birth control, whatever it may be. But we also, as a society, we have proven tools that will dramatically reduce those teenage pregnancy rates. We'll save money doing it. Every dollar invested in long-term and long-acting reversible contraceptives aimed at those teenagers will pay itself back 7 times over, because every Medicaid childbirth costs $12,000, which is a huge thing to prevent. And yet, when we have these tools, and we as a society don't implement them, that seems a real narrative of personal irresponsibility on the part of all of us. And so I think we somehow have to kind of balance the traditional philanthropy with the new kinds of philanthropy and impact investing, which are very powerful, and also advocacy to have government step up to the plate and try to create opportunity to try to address some of these broader problems we have.
We're almost out of time. I wanted to, before we end, ask you, if you're sitting in the audience today, or you're watching online, or you're seeing this clip on YouTube later, and you want to make a difference, and you just don't quite know how to start, you offer some practical tips at the end of where to start. Give us a synopsis of that for our audience here to leave us with how we can take early steps to make a difference.
Well, one thing I just also want to give a plug that there will be please do read the book, but on January 26th also there'll be a PBS version of the book that will air beginning January 26th, and then each Monday night after that. I guess what I would say is that, too often we tend to give because somebody asks. So we get a phone call, marketing call, and somebody mentions children with cancer or disabled veterans, and we kind of freeze and agree to donate without knowing anything about the caller on the other end of the phone. We would never buy a television like that. And in the same way, and people who are good at raising money aren't always the ones who are good at spending money. So I think it behooves us, where the stakes are so high, to think of our pro-social portfolio, if you will, as something like investing, and something that is important to invest wisely where there will be important returns, potentially life-saving ones. It doesn't seem to me to matter hugely whether you do that in East Palo Alto or in Congo. There are huge needs in both places, but I think it does. It is critical to try to invest in areas where there will be high returns, and there are plenty of those now.
And I would suggest, really, I am serious about a book club that you then can discuss with some friends to choose an area that you all might want to play a role in, and then perhaps an organization that you might want to affiliate with. Do it together. It's just a lot more fun, and it's great to be able to do it with a group of friends. You might even take it a lot farther, or come up with a new way of doing it. So I think that's what I would suggest.
Great. Nick and Sheryl, thank you so much for coming to Google. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much.